Winter 1917. In Petrograd, St. Petersburg, the heart of the Russian Empire, the air was not only cold, but filled with hatred. Millions of sons had been lost at the front, and those left behind had neither bread nor coal. Women waited for hours in the freezing cold for a single loaf of bread. Patience was on the verge of shattering. Tsar Nicholas II believed he was commanding the army at the front, while in his capital he had completely lost control. The marches that began on March 8th, International Women's Day, were not a celebration, but the execution order of an empire. Factories stopped, the streets filled. This time, soldiers refused to fire on the people, because within that crowd were their own mothers and sisters. March 15, 1917. As Nicholas attempted to return from the front, his train was stopped. His generals and advisors left him with only one option: abdication. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended in a train carriage, without a single bullet fired. As Nicholas laid down his crown, he perhaps could not yet imagine the tragic fate awaiting his family. Russia was now a republic, but it did not bring peace. A provisional government was formed, yet they made one fatal mistake. The war will continue. The people wanted bread. They wanted land. Above all, they wanted peace. In this vacuum of authority, the shadow of a man traveling across Europe in a sealed train was about to fall upon Petrograd. The Germans used their most dangerous weapon to destroy Russia from within: Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Exiled in Switzerland, Lenin was sent back to Russia like a virus aboard a special train provided by the Germans. When he arrived at Finland Station in April, he carried not a weapon but a promise: peace, bread, and land. Lenin called the provisional government's decision to continue the war a betrayal. He wanted to turn the imperialist war into a war classes. While the Russian army fought the Germans at the front, his revolutionary wind blowing from behind began to crumble trench discipline like a sandka. The wind of revolution did not strike Russia alone. On the Western Front in the spring of 1917, the French army stood on the brink of collapse. When the Nivelle Offensive ended in disaster, French soldiers refused to be led to slaughter like sheep. Tens of thousands mutinied. Yes to the war, no to the offensive, they declared. Soldiers bleated in the trenches to mock their generals and occupied train stations. General Pétain intervened, imposing harsh punishments while also promising better living conditions. The French army was restrained through executions and promises alike, but it was undeniable proof that the spirit of the war had been deeply wounded. In Russia, the provisional government's Minister of War, Kerensky, ordered one final grand offensive to hold the army together: July 1917. But the Russian army was no longer an army. It had become an armed peasant crowd. When the Germans counterattacked, Russian soldiers dropped their rifles and fled to their villages, eager to claim land distribution. The front line completely evaporated. Officers were shot by their own men. Ranks were torn from uniforms. The collapse of the Kerensky Offensive created the final chaos the Bolsheviks needed to seize power. Now in the streets of Petrograd, the cries of peace rang louder than gunfire. On the night of October 25th, November 7th in the new calendar, 1917, a shot from the cruiser Aurora signaled the start. Bolshevik Red Guard seized strategic points and entered the Winter Palace. In the midst of the Great War, one of the world's largest empires transformed into a communist state in a single night raid. Lenin's first decree was a decree on peace. Russia would withdraw from the war at any cost. For the Germans, this was a miracle. The Eastern Front was closing, but for the Western Allies, it was a terrible betrayal. Millions of German soldiers could now be transferred westward toward Paris. March 1918, the town of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolsheviks sat at the table with the Germans. The German terms were so severe that Trotsky, head of the Russian delegation, declared neither war nor peace and walked away. But as the German army continued to advance, Lenin was forced to swallow the bitter pill. Russia lost Poland, Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic states, half of its industry and agriculture. It was a surrender, but for Lenin, it was the only way to save the revolution. Russia was out of the war, but it was being dragged into an even bloodier civil war home, a struggle between the Reds and the Whites. Russia's withdrawal from the war sent shockwaves through the West. British and French leaders were furious. Headlines screamed, "The Russians stabbed us in the back." German divisions freed from the east began pouring westward by train. The beginning of 1918 was the darkest hour for the Allies. Unless fresh strength arrived to help, Paris would fall. The Allies had only one hope left. Would the giant across the Atlantic awaken? Could French and British lines withstand this German tide until the Americans arrived? The end of 1917 marked the beginning of a race. Would German divisions arrive first, or American ships? July 1918. A basement in Ekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas, his wife, and their 5 children were awakened from their sleep. They were told a photograph would be taken. Instead, the commander of the firing squad read their death sentence. The end of the Romanov dynasty was the most tangible proof of the destruction wrought by the Great War. A world order had collapsed, and in its place a bloody ideological struggle was born. Russia was no longer part of the war, but the waves it created would continue to shake the world. As 1917 ended, the world was no longer the world of 1914. Empires were cracking, kings were falling, peoples were awakening. The war had changed not only borders, but the very fabric of societies. But the story was not over yet. Would Germany's victory in the East grant it one last chance in the West? Or would America's entry change everything? In the next episode, we will cross the ocean toward that fresh power, toward a new destiny shaped in the shadow of submarines. I am your narrator, Origenes, and this is history, uncertain, fragile, and irreversible.